Welcome to our first Dean's Grand Round Speaker Series for the fall semester. And we are very delighted to have Dr. Monica Swahn, who is the inaugural Dean for the School of Public Health at the Virginia Commonwealth University. She's a psychiatric epidemiologist and internationally recognized expertise in global health, mental health, and gender-based violence and substance abuse. Uh, She leads the Onward project on well-being and adversity, which is one of the NIH-funded cohort study. It's a very exciting project. I'm sure she's going to be talking about that and her experience and expertise around that. She's well published, more than about 150 journal publications. She's champion for cross-sector collaborations. She was a former CDC scientist and a Fulbright scholar. And I will say that over the last couple of meetings that I have had with her, uh, I think we have an, a dean here who is very open to innovation, to trying new things, and to looking at how we can advance the not just a project-based approach, but how do we advance the field of public health through the lens of innovation and entrepreneurship. So I think that's a very important component. So thank you to all who have spent the effort to come here today. And I'm sure that you're going to enjoy this talk, and hopefully there will be a series of questions. And I expect some students to talk and ask what some messages they might need from our esteemed guests out over here. So welcome, Monica, and thank you so much.
So good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to see everyone, and an extra pleasure to those I had dinner with yesterday and met earlier this morning. It's very special when you get in front of a crowd and you see some familiar faces. So I'm going to do something a little different even for me today, and really hope that you'll have some thoughts to share with me by the time you're done, by the time we're done here today, or if you have feedback to share later. So this whole idea of thinking about global health diplomacy in action is actually a result for the conversation Dean Joshi and I had at the Deans and Director Retreat a couple months ago. And so again, I want to thank him personally for inviting me here and engaging in the conversation. And we've had some really, I think, thought-provocative and innovative conversations about where our partnership may lead. But more on that later. So today I'm going to share with you about my work, but I have framed my work in a different lens. And because your school is really revving up and having a tremendous impact. And I don't know if you see yourselves in that light, but as somebody who's been dean at another institution and now dean at VCU, certainly I look at other schools for ideas and for innovative thinking and for, again, who we can partner with. And so it is in that lens I wanted to talk about global health diplomacy and whether one can think about research as diplomacy. And given your leadership as an institution in health diplomacy, there's really nowhere else I can ask this question. So bear with me. I'm going to do a couple of things, perhaps too many things in this talk. And so I'm going to talk about global health diplomacy and what it may mean for research. I'm also going to share with you one of my favorite projects, this TOPOA study in Uganda. So I bring sort of a global health lens to this too, and I'm trying to weave it two together. So let's see if it all works. First of all, in preparation for this, I wanted to think about global health diplomacy. But those who have written about this have said that global health diplomacy as a concept or as a term, it has really eluded definitional precision. And again, we're not here to necessarily debate terms and how to best operationalize it. We can probably say the same thing for global health at this moment in time, but that's not where I'm going with this. I'm really just presenting sort of an opening for what is global health diplomacy. If we look at other people's definition, we usually talk about change activity. We talk about improving global health. We're talking about strengthening international relationships and conflict areas. We talk about multi-actor negotiation processes. We talk about, I like this one from Fauci, who we all know, winning hearts and minds of people in poor countries by exporting medical care expertise and personnel to help those who need most, which may be one of the least kind of traditional definitions or conceptual approaches. But again, trust and negotiation comes across as key themes, right? When we talk about global health diplomacy, or even if we think about it and we are those kind of people who have not given it much thought before. But it's basically trust and interaction, stakeholders and engaging people, right? For negotiating something that perhaps didn't exist before or making change, whether it's in community or larger policy levels. So cooperation and representation and all of that are key. So anyway, so I took that and then I thought about it and I said to myself, and again, this is the key research question. We'll come back to this at the end. Can a research project be an example of global health diplomacy in action? I don't know if what you're thinking right now. I'm hoping some of you will say yes. If some of you say no, maybe I can convince you. But if we end up with this and saying no, it doesn't work, that is fine too, because I really would like to refine my thinking on this. Because I think the world today needs that more than ever, right? We really need to think about not just from a US perspective, but the global scene, if you will, need much more diplomacy. And again, the question that I was talking to Dean Joshi about earlier, is this something we need to train students in doing? Should that be part of the curriculum, right? So this has layers. This question has layers. But what would it mean then if we think about global health diplomacy in action? When does research actually becomes diplomacy? Well, as we looked at some of those definitions together, it's about multi-actor collaborations. If any of you have done global health research, you know that research requires negotiation from the time you conceptualize something to when you get funding, to IRB approvals, to working with multiple actors to even implement the work, right? Science as a diplomatic tool. Sometimes, I'm a psychiatric epidemiologist by training. I used to think that if I published my work was done. But you can do so much more with the findings. You can translate it. You can engage communities, right? If you really go the whole way, science can be used as a diplomatic tool. Capacity building, I think, again, those of us who work in the global sector, capacity building and is inherent in what we do. Otherwise, I probably think we probably shouldn't be doing work in other countries if we're not genuinely interested in building expertise and sharing capacity and building for the future with a mind for sustainability. So whether it's training, mentoring, or resource sharing, it can take multiple forms, but I think it should be inherent in what we do. Is that diplomacy? Community engagement, highly related. Are we using participatory methods? Are we using sort of shared governance as we develop our projects or implement our evaluations? Are we reflective of people with lived experience on our advisory board? Are we using methodology where we actually learn? And finally, are we bridging global and local priorities? Are we aligning donor goals if these are funded projects with community needs for sustainable impact? So those are sort of some prongs that I thought about that, perhaps in these contexts, research can actually become diplomacy. So it's with all that, I'll take you to the city of Kampala. It's the capital of Uganda. The broader metro is a bustling area with more than 6 million people now. And I meant to say too that it's a landlocked country. And so with that comes limitations in terms of development and financial aspects, because it's always harder for landlocked countries to engage in trade, as an example, with other countries. But just a few facts about Uganda. And again, this is one of my favorite topics, so I really limit myself. But it's a rapidly growing population, more than 50 million estimated at this moment. Very diverse country in terms of languages and tribe and how the country is organized. In terms of size, it's very similar to Great Britain, if that means something to you. So not a huge country, but still obviously plenty of land. They're also known for the diverse wildlife, which you hear many people go on safaris in Uganda. And the number of bird species, for example, is really, really high. But when we talk about key health metrics, things are not looking as great. Life expectancy has increased over the last couple of years, so now it's about 66 years of age. But that said, 50% of the population is 15 years and younger. So when we talk about youth, as an example, Uganda and other countries in sub-Saharan Africa is really having this youth bulge that we're talking about. Other key health challenges include child and maternal health or mortality concerns. Malaria, HIV is still highly prevalent, similar with tuberculosis. And non-communicable diseases has really gotten a grip on the country as well. And in that context, there's a scarcity of healthcare workers, food insecurity, poor water quality, limited access to a lot of essential services. And in particular, in the areas where I work, which are centered around the slums of Kampala. And so, of course, the definition of a slum is that traditional infrastructure and such are really not present. I mean, that is sort of inherent in that environment. So I'm going to talk to you about the TOPOA project. And I love this word TOPOA. I don't know if we have any Luganda speakers among us, but TOPOA means to not give up, to never give up. It's really a word that represents resilience. So we picked that word and we built an acronym around it for this NIH project. But as we study mental health, and I'll share with you more in a second, we wanted it to have a sort of a positive name for the project that our community-based stakeholders and more importantly, our study participants would really feel, again, was hopeful and positive. So as I introduced the TOPOA study to you, and again, I'm a psychiatric epidemiologist by training, so mental health is at the core of what I do and have done for a long time. But as I designed this project as a call from an NIH call for proposals that came out, my team and I, when we saw this call for proposal, we dropped everything that we were doing. This call was on social drivers of mental illness in low and middle income countries, mechanisms and pathways of interventions for youth. And we had never seen such a call. We did not know it was coming. And since then, they've only had another call like this. And again, I would imagine in the current sort of landscape, we may not see one like this for a very long time. But we dropped what we were doing and we were lucky to get this funding. But when I designed this project, I really wanted to make sure we thought of it as interdisciplinary as possible. So it's all about women. It's a women's health project. Obviously, it's very focused on research. We have really embedded strong community engagement focus. It's centered in urban Kampala, so it's urban health. I think of it as a women empowerment project as well, because again, we're trying to improve the lives of women and really mitigate the social drivers of poverty. It's capacity building, given all the training and outreach, and again, how we built the team in Uganda. It is central to mental health. But the basic research questions is really about vocational training and entrepreneurship. And I come back to that too, but those are other two prongs. M Health, if you're familiar with that, actually, I think you have a mobile health lab using wearables and sensors as appropriate. And then, of course, partnerships. So I did this kind of circle of different ways to think about this project. So hopefully there's something for everyone. I'm going to talk a couple key terms. I try not to use acronyms as much as I can, but I thought I should just spell a couple out since you may see them on some slides. Adolescent girls and young women. RDoC stands for Research Domain Criteria, which is a concept used by NIH to study multiple levels of influences, particularly mental health. SDOMH, social determinants of mental health, which I think in an audience like this, you're probably very familiar with. Now, CEST is a new one, and we totally made this one up. If you write grant proposals, you really struggle to preserve the word count. And so when we say vocational training, we came up with this term called socioeconomic strengthening targeted training, which we called CEST for short. So you may see this on a couple of slides, and if I forget to mention it. And TOPOA is that word, never give up. But again, we spelled it out in NIH fashion, the Onward Project on Wellbeing and Adversity. So quickly, the overview of this project is that it's a 5-year NIH-funded R01, and TOPOA means not to give up. It's located in 3 different communities in Kampala, Banda, Bryce, and Mikinje. We have engaged and we have multiple project components, but all project components were having participant ages 18 to 24. And that was also in part because the NIH call for proposals called for a project on youth, and the upper limit of that is age 24. And so we've done a photo voice project, we've done multiple focus groups, we have done mapping project, a little bit more on that later. And we also have a very engaged youth advisory board. And overall in the prospective cohort, and I'm going to come back to all of this because I kind of just want to give you an overview so that you're mentally primed for what I'm going to be talking about. The cohort study, which is the most impactful part of the project, has 2 arms, 300 women, 150 in the intervention condition and 150 in what we call a community comparison group. So this is really a project that is first of its kind. basically, the very simple overarching research question is to examine if vocational training, entrepreneurship skills, and empowerment in forms of psychosocial support leads to better mental health outcomes among women who live in the slums of Kampala. Now, there's a lot of sophisticated science behind there, but that is the one overarching question. But in a large project like this, as you know, there are multiple subcomponents to it. So wanted to show you a couple of pictures quickly about so you can appreciate what the urban environment looks like where we work and where we're studying. Um, our key partner, the Uganda Youth Development Link, they run these resource centers, if you will, where they train the vocational training and they also provide psychosocial support or they refer young people for HIV testing. So here we are at one point doing an outreach activity. And so they love when we visit, and usually there's a lot of music and song and dance, which again builds community and really welcome visitors. So this is the Bonda Center, and that's sort of what it looks like. And so the vocational training skills we're teaching these women is a 3-month program, and this is exactly what it looks like. It's a sort of a bare bones situation or context, but it's very much focused on braiding the beautiful African hair, and it's also about nails and health and things like that. But this is the context in which they learn. Again, 3-month program. Here's another couple of pictures of what it looks like when they're practicing and everything from sort of bridal updos to sort of regular things. And again, they're just very proud of learning these skills. So in terms of the study components, I mentioned we do focus groups, photo voice, community mapping, cohort studies where we have video tracking. We also have saliva samples and drug screening. We do a neuroscience task, which is called a fear startle conditioning lab test. And I'm not going to say much about that today, but if anybody has questions, I'm glad to talk about it. But one of the core features that we're also looking at is sleep. And so we introduced Garmin wearables to study sleep patterns, and we paired that with some daily diaries to really also get their own recall or their own views on their sleeping patterns. So just showing sort of what it looks like, that neuroscience task. You see one of our research assistants, she, dressed up or experienced, because again, I wanted the whole research team to understand exactly the entire study protocol, so all of them engaged it. So when we bring women in to do the neuroscience part of the study protocol, they see pictures of their research assistants all around going through the experience as a way to also destigmatize the experience and kind of demystify, because again, it can look a little bit frightening if you don't know exactly what it looks like. That's a picture of the garments that we used, and we've actually written quite a bit about the capacity building around using the garments, and then the self-reported diary, the daily diary, the drug using kits, and how we collected saliva samples for those of you who might be interested in the other science components. So the focus groups were really important for us. As we embedded this project as a social determinants and social drivers, we wanted to hear from the young women directly. What is the social environment like? What is it like to live in the urban slums? What did they perceive to be the stressor in the urban environment? And also we had focus groups with women who have already gone through the vocational training to ask them about mental health and health trajectories following the vocational training. And I hope you also follow the whole point of the vocational training is for the women to be employed and earn money and really uplift themselves to the extent possible from the environment that they live in. Photo voice was very similarly focused, but if any of you have done photo voice, you also know that it's about engaging participants to take photos, because sometimes it's hard to express oneself in words. Some of the contexts that we're talking about, mental health and well-being, sometimes are very abstract. And so seeing pictures of how women thought themselves about the environment that they navigate every day was just incredibly helpful. And they also found the experience very empowering. We also did community mapping. It's not something that I'm going to talk much about today, but just to say that, there are tools, particularly here in the US and Europe, that looks at indices, if you will, about urban environment and risk. And we're trying to understand, there's a really well built out research, for example, in terms of alcohol marketing or alcohol outlet density. And we tried to replicate some of that. It didn't work too well. And so if we're going to move that forward, we need to really reconceptualize it. And again, the cohort study is really the meat of this project at this moment in time. We are more than halfway through with the cohort study, but there's still room if anybody has idea for things that we could potentially include before data collection is over. But again, as I mentioned earlier, it's really about understanding the mechanistic pathways of how mental illness develop and progress over a 2-year period. And also, as I mentioned, we had an intervention cohort and a comparison cohort to understand if vocational training really improves those mental health outcomes. So again, all of this is nested within the social determinants of mental health as was required by the call for proposals. And again, if any of you are working with NIH or National Institute of Mental Health, they're very keen on their research domain criteria. So all that we work has been nested within that as well. We are using, as I mentioned, this multi-component 27-month parallel prospective cohort study. We have 300 participants. We interview them every 3 months. We do sort of the expanded version with the neuroscience and the saliva and all of that at 3 time points. We call them T1, T2, and T10 out of the 10 time points that we're engaging with these women. And next week, we're starting T7. So you can see that we are more than halfway through. And interestingly, the retention for this project has been very high. We still have 290 or to 300 women still coming back, which is really interesting because people thought we couldn't do a cohort study with this kind of populations given the hardship that they face. Again, as I mentioned, SES is our short term for the socioeconomic strengthening targeted training. I already showed you the pictures of that. But from the science point of view, the whole idea is that this training really moderating the pathway between the adverse effects of the poverty, meaning the social drivers, and mental illness. And so that's sort of conceptually how that fits in. For any of you who are grant proposal writers, this is what our aims look like. Specific aim was really all about the formative work that we were doing, the mixed methods, the focus groups, the mapping, the photo voice, etc. So all of that has been completed, although we're writing and using that data. Specific aim 2 was all about the prospective cohort study when we talk again about how to understand both the proximal social environmental stressors that impact these women's lives and how we can measure that over time. So the conceptual model is quite complex. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I couldn't come up here and talk to you about this project without sort of sharing the science behind the scenes. So you see that blue bar on top, and it's all the proximal social and environmental stressors that we measure. So it's everything from unemployment and low income and housing and food insecurity and so forth. But you see this kind of peach color bar to the right is also about the neighborhood characteristics and exposure. And in those daily diaries, we also get their self-report how often they interact or intersect with some of the stressors that they again have shared with us through the formative work that is really impacting their mental health. Alcohol and drug use is central to all of this. And the outcomes here are mental health problems. So we measure anxiety, we measure depression and suicidality, and we measure substance use disorders. So the science behind all of this gets to be quite complex. But back to sort of some implementation issues. I mentioned that we have a youth advisory board, and I'm going to share a little bit more about them in a minute. But we also have sort of the distinguished advisory board, for a lack of a better word, where we have some really phenomenal expertise. And I think we were also somewhat strategic as we invited people. So Dr. Hafsa, for example, she has a new title. I forgot to update the slide, but she works for the Ministry of Health, and she is a very senior figure within Uganda. And so the fact that she has taken a great interest in our project and that she's a resource to us, and we meet at least twice a year. Actually, usually often I meet with her when I travel to Uganda. So she represents the Ugandan government. Dr. Daniel Kello represents the city government, and so he takes a keen interest too as how we, did our mapping and how we communicate about the urban environment, which he ultimately is centered around. And then we have some other experts on various things, but I wanted to point out Noel Kumunda too, who just recently left the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development, but another Ugandan entity that is very keen on figuring out how to uplift women in poverty and how to support and sustain, progress in that area. So we're very excited about our advisory board, and they have been phenomenally supportive, to this project. So back again to how I started this about when research becomes diplomacy. Just wanted to remind you as I'm now going to, as I've given you an overview of the project, I want to give you a couple of different examples of how I think how we actually operationalize this. And so we'll see what you think about that. But I also wanted to point out that, I did serve as a Fulbright to Uganda over a 3-year period. And I don't actually know if I started out saying I've been working in Uganda for some almost 20 years at this point. So this is not by any means my first project there. So I apologize if I left that out. So one of the things that has been very fruitful for us as well is President Museveni, who's been president of Uganda for a very long time. One of his key platform topics has been skill building, in part because unemployment is high, in part also because they have such a large proportion of their population who is young. So while we have no interaction with his vocational skill training, it is something that the country is united around, that skill building is incredibly important for the development of the country, but also to take better care of their citizens and giving them opportunities. And so last year, I was very honored to actually host a group of visitors from the Uganda government, actually the senior advisor to the president, who came to our data collection site in Kampala and wanted to know everything. I'd heard that they might be interested, but I did not know that they were actually planning to show up. And so, but we were tremendously and super excited that they did, because again, having that kind of support is priceless in this environment. So the president's office is very eager for us to share our findings, and we're getting close, but we want to make sure that things have been published and vetted before we do. So capacity building and community engagement for this kind of project, in my views, really goes hand in hand. And as I mentioned, I've been in Uganda for a long time, and I also know the expression that we use in Uganda is that we network with our feet. Right? We can't just send an email or call. We actually have to show up and shake hand and be incredibly respectful about what we are intending to do and the mutual benefit of those. And so I would like to think that I have some substantial experience with that at this point, but it's something that we need to embed in the project really at every step. And so I go to Uganda on average maybe 3 or 4 times per year. Some of that is study abroad, some of it is project specific, some of it are other projects as well. But I really try to do some kind of outreach and engagement every time I go to really prioritize that, just to make sure that that relationship that we're forming is authentic, but also because things shift in real time. And so that I'm keen on adapting the project if needed, as a way to meet the stakeholders' needs. And so some examples of that, usually we have people come to the data collection site. And so in December, for example, where I had a lunch and learn on some analysis we've done on climate change, and I'm going to share those with you in a little bit. But otherwise, there's been great interest in the use of wearables. Now, if any of you are using wearables, you know how complicated those analyses are. But there's a keen interest of building up much more capacity with wearables. And so we've been spending a substantial amount of time on that. But sometimes it's really just also talking about mental health and what kind of low resource type interventions may be available. A couple words about our youth advisory board. So I mentioned that I meet with my more senior advisory board at least twice a year. I do the same with these young women. We have 15 young women who represent the same communities where we did most of our data collection, and I meet with them twice a year. And I always meet with them in person because it really would not make sense to meet with them in the virtual space. And so, having just come back from Uganda about a week and a half ago, I met with them, and these meetings are some of the things that fuel me the most about my visit. And this time we talked about resilience, because many of our analysis now, as we're trying to evaluate the intervention, trying to figure out how resilience is operationalized and which measures, did we collect the right measures? Do we need to sneak in some new measures? And these women, the first time I met them, so more than 2 years ago, they were very quiet and very shy. They didn't know one another. And I'm thinking, oh boy, are we going to get these women to really share? And now they're all raising their hands and they don't want to end the meetings. They have more things to share. And I asked them, I said, have you reflected on the progression of these meetings? And they said, well, it's about respect. It's about you listening to us. It's about you actually acting on what we share. And of all the things that I learned in my last visit, I mean, that has resonated with me, but it takes time to build. It's and sometimes time is not what we have. So you have to make time for these kind of things. But anyway, we printed them these shirts, and it was funny because I, asked when they wanted the shirts, what do you want it to say? We can put anything on the shirts for you, and they wanted youth leader. And I think that that's really powerful for these young women that they see themselves as youth leaders in their communities. And the only thing I do with them, in essence, is meeting with them twice a year and giving them a forum to be heard. That's sometimes all it takes. So, like I said, we engage with a lot of different stakeholders because that has to be the key priority. And so, really have to make time for that always. I also usually do a community tour in the communities that we engage with. Even though we have finished recruitment for this study, the cohort is already going. I usually just walk around so that they remember me, that I'm there. And as I mentioned, it's a very young population, so there are children everywhere. And I just want them to have a positive impression that we just don't come to the communities when we need something, that I make myself available and I walk by the community leaders and said, hey, how are things going? And I do greet them in Luganda, like in Sanyisukukula Baba Sebo, like, and that means something, and how small that is, again, it's really just for us to make time. And I also take the visitors and the other, project leaders in the communities, because again, we cannot sit here in the United States and write papers about a project that is situated in Uganda without understanding the local context. So again, kind of bridging on that science as a diplomatic tool, bridging local and global priorities. Incredibly important for us to listen again what the community needs. I'm not really going to talk much about these mental health data, but it's a mental health study. I'm sure the question will come up, what do the mental health factors look like in this community of women? And unfortunately, we were right on. Suicidality is relatively high, anxiety is high, depression is high. Drug abuse, fortunately, is not very high, but I think that's probably more around limited access. In terms of severity of mental health outcomes, as a psychiatric epidemiologist, I also know that the population of young women that we're studying is just the onset of more severe mental illness that usually happens in the young 20s. And so these are baseline findings, and it's just a way for us to sort of look at the severity of the self-reported mental health outcomes. And again, substance use, very low in terms of problem. Suicidality inherently is obviously one of the most severe mental health outcomes. And so we're very troubled by that. But there are very high levels of depression and anxiety, and some of that is very severe as well. Now, we try to publish in a layered way. And again, the study is still underway. The teams are still looking at some of more of the harder sciences. But we try to share lessons learned, not only through publications, but also through, like I mentioned, the outreach. So even doing this photo boys, for example, surprisingly, there's not been that many photo boys projects. We also, again, try to conceptualize this idea of place and mental health that are also very abstract terms. And so I'll just flash through a couple of the key publications that we've had. Obviously, mental health and stress and life satisfaction are all core of what we're doing. But if you look at the one top right, we actually did an interesting study about self-reported alcohol use versus the drug screening of alcohol use, and found substantial underreporting of self-reported alcohol use, right? And so that means that if we don't do a good job and build rapport with our participants, all of this will be substantially underreported. Um, in terms of the wearables, it's really intriguing that a country like Uganda, very low uptake. I mean, again, if I were to ask you to raise your hands, how many of you have wearables? Like I do, probably many of you do too. But in the Ugandan context, very few people are still using in 2025 using wearables. Not even, I think, because of the expense, but because the value added might have not been presented. But there is a strong interest from health researchers and such to really leverage wearables and what they can offer. And so we have published extensively, and we did multiple focus groups, and it was interesting how the young women reacted to the wearables and actually how they perceived the community around them reacted to the wearables. And so we've done our best, not only in terms of outreach, but sharing these concerns to kind of make it easier for others to kind of replicate in the use of this technology. And I say that because I had colleagues in a neighboring country that introduced wearables, and they had to stop the project 3 times to figure out things like battery life and how the participants were reacting. And there's a tremendous cost and waste of everybody's time, including the participants, if we don't sort this out before we start. So just a couple of things about sort of one sub-study that we did in response to the community's request as we were, conducting this cohort study. Environmental health concerns is really a significant concern. Again, particularly in the slums, as the infrastructure isn't supportive of garbage removal, sanitation, and things like that, and it impacts really all aspects of life. So one thing that came up through our photo voice and through our engagement with our advisory boards and the young women is, what this environment looks like and about climate and climate anxiety. I, at the time, perhaps thought that it wouldn't be a topic that they would have articulated as such because I thought for some reason, I don't know what I was thinking, it was one shouldn't have these assumptions. Anyway, listening to the community is key, and incorporating what they think is important, really important. So through the photo voice, we captured a lot of environmental health concerns, and through those conversations, we realized we had to add more measures to the project. And so some of the measures that we added were climate change anxiety. Again, we have to stay true to the NIH intent. It's not like we can abandon the original scope of the project, but we can certainly add measures that the community feel is very important. So we added some measures on climate change anxiety, and found that 1 in 5 women, again, the strength of our study is not at all prevalence. It's a very small study. Our strength are the repeated measures. But that said, cross-sectionally, 1 in 5 women presented with moderate to severe climate change anxiety. And that's much higher than I would have ever expected in the environment. We're talking young women who are not necessarily reading the news the way we would think about, and where terms like climate change anxiety perhaps would not have come across. But the interesting thing is, the women who reported climate change anxiety was largely fueled by general anxiety. And so we tried our best. And again, this was sort of a secondary, or it was a new aim of the study, if you will, to look at this, and we weren't the best set up. But now we can look at these measures over time to see how they were impacted. But it was also interesting that almost half of them reported that they were themselves impacted regarding global warming, for example. And when they talk about how they might have been impacted by climate change effects or impacts, storms were coming up as the most common one, heat waves, floods, and drought. But again, when there's floods and when storms are coming through Kampala, and particularly if you live in a low-lying area like the slums, everything washes away. I mean, it's really, I can see how it impacts. So now we're adding more questions so that we can understand that, since climate change anxiety was so prevalent, we really need to understand that in the context of the other mental health outcomes that we're exploring. When we tried to differentiate between, general anxiety and climate change, there really weren't that many predictors. Secondary higher education, but that's almost meaningless in a study like this where the education is in such a truncated range. Older age, over 20, again, is that really a meaningful indicator when we're talking about women in such a narrow age range from 18 to 24? Living with 2 or 3 household generations, I thought was interesting. And perhaps it is when you live with an older generation that has more historical context of how things used to be, perhaps that is something that impact. But again, the key driver in the analysis we did was general anxiety disorder. So again, so sort of wrap that up, high level of awareness of climate change and high level of climate change anxiety and direct experiences of that, I think was really important and something we need to figure out how to do. And again, this whole idea of parenting and living in smaller household significantly associated with higher climate change really speaks also to opportunities for education and outreach, perhaps in a different way. So what we're going to do that, we know we're using this information in the vein that I talked to you about before about really being proactive, other things that we can build out in terms of educational initiatives and things like that. Again, we're working very closely with our community-based partner. There's some really interesting area work in South Africa, for example, where they're painting the rooftops in the slums as a way to reflect sunlight better, which lowers the temperature in the housing, for example. So there might be some interesting things we can build on, even though that's not a core, core project aim. So again, just want to come back to this whole important part of integrating the local realities in projects like this. So this obviously is an NH-funded project, but we have designed it to really continuously receive local input and guidance, really important. I didn't mention our Uganda Youth Development Link partner, but again, I partnered with them for over 20 years. And so they have been really instrumental in this. The Youth Advisory Board providing input on the study protocol and implementation, as well as our other advisory board, capturing lived experience, not only on the advisory board, but through focus groups and photo voice. And again, listening to local concerns. Like, again, we wouldn't have done these climate change anxiety type analysis or included measures on that had we not been prompted to do so. So that is really an important part. And then a couple of thoughts about how to bridge, these priorities. Local partnerships, clearly key. Participatory research elements, to which, to the extent that one can do this in this context, and depending on the topic, of course. But this bidirectional capacity building is equally important. And then policy alignment. So I mentioned, for example, President Museveni, skilling is skill building, youth empowerment, vocational training is something that everybody can rally behind, regardless of their sort of political leanings. So come back to that now as I'm wrapping up, reflections for the global health diplomacy. Can we think about the TOPOA project experience as providing these lessons? Can research itself be diplomacy? Can we think of science as building bridges? Can long-term trust and trust-based partnerships, can they foster this? Is that how we can think about how we negotiate and make an impact sort of as change makers? Can we think about community engagement as legitimizing this work and ensuring impact, sustainability? Again, I will always argue that evidence must be communicated in sort of layered ways that resonates with multiple audiences. It's just incredibly, I think, critical. So I summed it up sort of here in the little box below, right? That successful diplomacy in global health comes from aligning scientific goals with community needs and policy opportunities. So before I totally close it out, I want to say a thank you to my phenomenal team that shows up at the data collection site every day, and they take the best care of our participants, which is why our young women are coming back and have really invested their time and energy in sharing their data about their lives. This is a huge project team. We have multiple institutions. Actually, this is the wrong version of the slide. I just left KSU. But anyway, we have multiple institutions. And if you also want to partner with us on this, there's still life left in this project. So welcome that. And of course, I need to acknowledge the NIH funding, and they all, if as much as we're grateful for that funding, and again, it's going through a transfer of institution review at this moment. But of course, NIH wants me to tell you that this content is my responsibility, and they may or may not agree with, their official views. But so I want to make sure that I do my due diligence in that. So with that, I want to thank you for your time and inviting me here. It's just been a pleasure. And I also wanted to share that I have started a LinkedIn TOPOA project writing group because we are swimming in data. And so if any of you are LinkedIn, you'll see that we have a TOPOA project page, but there's also a TOPOA project writing group where I'm going to share sort of topic ideas that the core team does simply not have time to do. And so if anybody is interested in that. So that is it.